week. Our speaker today is Bethany Wilkinson. She's a part of Plywood People, and it's a nonprofit organization in Atlanta where she leads creative events and builds organizational partnerships. She also leads the Diversity Gap, which explores equity-centered institutional changes. She co-founded Atlanta Harvest in 2013 and founded G-Race Dialogues in 2015. She has degrees in education, community building, social change, and theology. We're delighted to have her with us today and excited to learn about the important work that she's doing along with her organization. Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to Bethany Wilkinson.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you. Such a warm introduction, which is great because it's so rainy outside. Let me grab my clicker here. Hi, I'm glad to be here, so thanks for having me. So I'm going to get into a little bit about Plywood, a little bit about the Diversity Gap, and some content and research that I'm doing. But we were thinking that it would be really helpful before I get into the diversity and inclusion nitty-gritty to share a little bit of my background and my story. So, hi, I'm Bethany. This is me, 7 years old. My mom took me to get glamour shots. My dad was not very happy about that. But I grew up in a small town here in Georgia called Monticello, Georgia, 3,000 people, 2 stoplights. And I started thinking about race and diversity at a really early age. I was tracked into a gifted program where I was the only black person in that program until I was in 11th grade. So first grade to 11th grade, only black person in the program. So Monticello, that place, has really shaped a lot of who I am. I left Monticello, Mighty Marching Hurricanes, that was high school, and I went to Emory University here in Atlanta, small town girl, big city. I tried to leave after the first semester because I was so overwhelmed, but my dad was like, no, you're going to stick this thing out. So I went to Emory where I really first encountered more people beyond myself who were thinking about race in a way that was constructive and critical and thoughtful. I was like, oh, people devote their entire lives to studying this phenomenon. Maybe I should do that. So I got really interested in social change movements, development work, both domestic and abroad, studied abroad, did all sorts of trips to learn more about intersections of identity and social change. So that was Emory. Left Emory, got an internship working at my church on the west side of the city, Grace Midtown, as a community development apprentice. I did not know what I was doing, and I was very naive, but I thought that we could be really helpful in theory in terms of building community in this particular neighborhood. I did move into the neighborhood, had a great time, but I realized that church work wasn't really a good fit for me. It was at that point that I met a friend who actually graduated from tech, and he wanted to start a farming company. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I don't have any other plans. And so before starting the company, I joined the team at Captain Planet Foundation, which is a nonprofit here that does a lot with school gardens, because I didn't know anything about growing food. So I'm thinking, if I'm going to help Corbin start a company, I need to learn how to grow food. So I did that. After Captain Planet Foundation, I joined the team at Atlanta Harvest. So Corbin and I had this great plan to build 6 high tunnel hoop house, they're like greenhouse-like structures to grow lettuce on a parking lot in South Atlanta. We did that, we built it. I was miserable because I didn't know how hard entrepreneurship was, and nobody told me, and he didn't know either because we were both 23, 24 and just trying to figure it out. So did Atlanta Harvest for a couple of years, got really burned out, and so I got a job at a garden retail center called Farmer D Organics. And this was a really interesting season because all of my big picture plans to change the world kind of evaporated, I guess, because here I am selling plants for $4 a piece at this little retail center. But I did meet my husband there, and so it all worked out, and we've been married for 2.5 years. So Farmer D's left there. It was 2014, 2015, and everything was kind of hitting the fan as Black Lives Matter was gaining momentum, and just the conversation on race and justice and the dialogue on everything from Facebook to in my real life just became more contentious. And so me and a friend started another project called Grace Dialogues, day-long racial justice trainings to help people in faith-based organizations and churches have more constructive conversations about race and no problem. While I was doing that, that was like my side hustle. So my full-time job was actually working at Good Samaritan Health Center, also on the west side of the city. I managed their farm for a little while, which I loved. But then I got promoted into this middle management role that I hated so much. I was so bored just sending emails. And I learned in that season, I thrive when I'm on a small team and I can kind of feel like I'm in charge a little bit. This middle management thing is not a good fit for me. And it was around that time that I ended up getting connected with Plywood, and that's my current job. And this is kind of a funny story. I was running Grace Dialogues on the side in this job that I was not enjoying, and I connected with one of my mentors, and they were like, hey, are you thinking of starting your own organization? I was like, yeah, I'm always thinking of starting my own thing. And he was like, well, you should get connected to Jeff Schoenberger, who's the founder of Plywood People. Plywood is a nonprofit here in Atlanta leading a community of startups doing good. So we as an organization support nonprofit, for-profit, and creative founders of social impact projects. So my mentor's like, you need to talk to Jeff, and I tried. I sent all of these cold emails saying, hey, I have an idea, someone help me, I want to start this thing, and I didn't hear anything. And so I ended up, by a series of events, I ended up traveling to Los Angeles for a conference on community development. While I was there, I met a woman in a workshop on creative writing. And I was like, hey, her name's Amina. I was like, hey, Amina, I want to start a thing in Atlanta. She's like, awesome, this is really great. When we get back to Atlanta, send me an email and we'll connect. So I send Amina this email. This is going somewhere. I send her an email, and she follows up with me, which doesn't always happen. And she's like, great, I want to connect you to this guy named Brett Trapp. Brett is like a creative marketing storytelling guy who I really love here in Atlanta. And so me, Brett, and Amina, we all get coffee. Brett takes a selfie of us, puts it on Instagram. The founder of Plywood is friends with Brett, goes to my blog via my Instagram page, reads it, and then says, hey, I want to meet you. And I was like, this is insane. I had to go all the way to LA to meet someone who literally lives across the city from me. And so we connected, and then like a month later, he was like, hey, do you want to come work for me? And I was like, yes. So I was so bored in my middle management job. So this is the jungle gym of my experience thus far. It's been 7 to 8 years. I've learned that I care a lot about social impact, social change, and a lot about figuring out what my unique role and contribution is in the midst of that. At Plywood, I'm the director of our programs, and so all of our training and curriculum and content for social entrepreneurs, I create that and help disseminate it and make sure that it's actually doing the things that we say it's going to do. So all of that brings me to the diversity gap. It was about this time last year that our team at Plywood started thinking, okay, Bethany, you're really passionate about racial justice and equity work, and we have a lot of founders in our community who don't know what they're doing, or they don't have any vision for diversity and equity. What can we do to kind of start to fill this gap? And so I launched the Diversity Gap Project in January of this year, and it's really a couple of things. On one hand, it's a research project, so I'm doing qualitative interviews, connecting with people of color in majority white contexts or organizations, but then I'm also running a podcast and doing an event series and all of these things. Ultimately, my goal is to explore the gap between our good intentions and our good impact as it relates to racial justice, organizational culture, and change. Good intentions and good impact. So to kick off my research, I started the year and I had this list of people that I knew I wanted to talk to. And it was my very first day of doing interviews, and I had 2 sets planned. So I had one set planned for the morning, then I had one interview scheduled for that afternoon. And it was interesting that this was my first day of conversations, because these 2 conversations I'm about to tell you about have really blown open this entire topic for me. And so story number 1. I sat down with 2 black women who both work for a large international nonprofit. So they're doing development work across the world. And these 2 women were on the innovation team, and they were on the international task force for this nonprofit. And so I'm asking them questions like, how's your experience here? Does your organization have a diversity and inclusion strategy? Just, trying to get a feel for how they were experiencing life. And I was really surprised, because over the course of our conversation, Both of the women said that even though we're in this majority culture organization, at the end of the day, we feel heard, we feel uplifted, we feel seen, and we feel supported when we come to work every day. One of the women said, because I can be myself here, I can bring my best to the rest of the work that I do. And so I left that conversation thinking, well, maybe the problem isn't as bad as I think. These are two black women. They're having a minority experience in this organization, but they feel pretty good. So that was really interesting. But then story number 2, literally 4 or 5 hours later, I was talking to another black woman, and this woman was or is an architect. And so she works for a very small firm, and I was asking her a lot of the same questions, do you feel like you can belong here, and do you like your work, and what are some of the racial and gender dynamics of your workplace? I asked her, one of my later questions, I asked her very specifically, can you be yourself at work? And I'm going to read her answer to you verbatim because it's been really powerful for me. She says, no, not at all. And I say that quite emphatically. It doesn't cause me stress or anything. It's so ingrained now, the code switching. She says, I'm naturally a leader with a very dominant personality, but I don't want to be seen as an aggressive black person, so I can't be myself. As a woman, I have to make everything sound like a suggestion rather than a direct order. I always have to play this mediator role between the architects and the contractors, even though no one else on my team does. She said, it's frustrating, never being able to be myself, never being able to share with my coworkers, especially if something's happening in the news. I have no black coworkers because the firm is so small. I'm the only woman and the only black person. It can become exhausting and mentally draining. And so then I asked her, do you think the diversity gap, however you define it, do you think it can be closed in your industry? And she said, no, not without major changes. And so as I reflected on these two stories, and again, this was just my first day of interviews. I've done since then 42 more of not just black people, but people from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. As I reflected on these two stories, I was trying to figure out, okay, what's the big difference here? All of these 3 women, they all have advanced degrees. They all have at least 5 to 7 years in their industry. What's going on? Why are they having such different experiences? And in reflecting on their stories and the stories that I've gathered since then, the big difference has been that the women from the first conversation, they had a really intentional leader. They had a person in their corner, on their team, advocating for them, understanding their story, their background, their contributions, their experiences. And that intentional leader completely shifted the culture of their team and their workplace. Another thing I've been realizing is that we as leaders or people of influence, we really do get to choose what the cultures of the future will be. We get to decide by our action or our inaction whether or not we're going to replicate what's always been done or if we want to create something new. And so a question that might come up at this point is, okay, well, what do these intentional leaders do? What really sets them apart in their leadership? Number 1, I have 3 of these. Number 1, I have found that intentional leaders dignify people. And it's so simple, but we miss it all the time. They dignify people. And dignifying people really comes down to who you value and whose stories matter to you. Intentional leaders, especially when it relates to diversity, understand that diversity is not just a quota marker or a number. Numbers help, but that's not what it's about. They understand that it's not just a business development strategy. Yes, there can be a business case for it, but that's not what it's about. And diversity is not this fixed point that you get to. You don't ever arrive there. They understand that diversity is dignifying. I'm being redundant, but it's a communication tactic. I really want you to walk away thinking, this is important. Am I dignifying the people around me? Diversity is change-oriented. It's constantly adapting to the people who are or who are not in the room. And then it's people-centric. It's not just about the business case or the creative case or the innovation case. It's about the real humans living out their real lives and bringing their real gifts to the table. The second thing intentional leaders do, before I get there, this is a quote from one of those conversations. She said, I used to think diversity was a thing we could achieve, but diversity is a way of being. It influences every decision that you make. The second thing that I find intentional leaders do is they pay attention to power. They pay attention to power, and this is a tricky one because I think we overlook it. But intentional leaders know that it's not enough to get a variety of colors of people or a variety of genders in a room. It's about who holds the power in that space, who gets to make decisions, who's setting the tone, who's driving the agenda. So who has the most power in your business or organization? This presentation is normally given to entrepreneurs. Maybe there are some of you in the room, but just to give you a little extra context. Who has the most power? Decision-making power. Who makes the most decisions or whose decisions affect the most people? That's two ways to think about it. Number two, money. Like literally, who makes the most money or who makes the most decisions about money? That's power in an organization. Number three, influence. Whose title or perceptions about that person, who carries the most influence in a given space. And then lastly, voice. Who is literally crafting the messages, writing the copy, deciding what's going on the website. These are all ways that power is playing out in our organizations and businesses. Number three, this is the third thing that intentional leaders do. They practice costly hospitality. They practice costly hospitality, not just once, but over and over and over again. Inclusion is ultimately, in my opinion, about hospitality, and it's about welcoming people. And it's not just doing it one time, like, oh, we had that one onboarding session and we told them that this is a value of ours. It's like, no, what are you doing in an ongoing, consistent, uncomfortable way to make sure that people who are having a marginal or an underrepresented experience on your team can feel integral to what you're creating. So the question for this is, what are you willing to do to ensure that people from diverse backgrounds are integral to what you're creating? Not just token, not accessory, not expedient, not good for your marketing campaign, but truly integral to whatever is happening in a business or organization. Inclusion isn't a quota system. Inclusion is when people feel seen, feel valuable, have the ability to lead, and to be a part of what's happening. So those are three things that intentional leaders do. And a big question that I often get is like, okay, this is great. How do they do that? What are they thinking about? What are these questions what are questions that might actually shift a person's life or culture? And so I'm going to walk through 5 areas with you pretty quickly to unpack different areas where you can maybe be more intentional about the diversity and the equity and the inclusion in your own life. As a note, I'm about to go through a lot more information, so don't feel the need to capture all of it, but listen for the thing that resonates most with you. Maybe you disagree, and so it resonates that way, or maybe you're really challenged by it and it resonates that way. Listen for the one thing that you can take beyond this moment. So, 5 areas where leaders can be more intentional. There's you, the person, the leader, influence, whether you're leading yourself or a family or a team of 1,000. There's your vision for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are the people around you involved in what you're making or leading. There are the places you spend your time. And then there are the stories that fill your life. These are 5 areas where you can begin closing the diversity gap. So I'm going to walk through them. Intentionally inclusive leaders embody racial and ethnic self-awareness. This is one of my favorites because oftentimes I'm working with people who think, hey, I want to have more of X group on my team. And my thought is, awesome. What are you doing to be a healthy leader for that person? How aware are you? Do you know what it means when you show up in a room, what your race or ethnicity is communicating, or your gender, whatever you're presenting? How aware are you of yourself and how your leadership might affect them? So they embody self-awareness. Number 2, they have an understanding of the isms. And this depends on which group you're looking to include. But I tend to think when people sit down with me and they say, hey, I want more black women on my team, I'm thinking, okay, do you understand racism and how it may or may not be functioning in this environment? So an understanding of the various isms or systems of oppression are really important to shifting your culture. And then lastly, a commitment to the process. Again, this isn't something you can do one time. It's an ongoing, ever-evolving commitment that leaders have to make. Number 2, vision. You become what you imagine. How much time are we devoting to actually imagining the thing that we want to see? It can be really hard to create it because we've never had it before. And so I highly recommend that people take the time to think, what am I trying to create? And why is this important to me? And who do I need to be involved in crafting this vision with me? Have clarity about your why. A lot of people will jump to the how, they'll jump to the what, and those pieces are important. But if you aren't grounded in the purpose of this work for your life, for your organization, when things get tough, it's really tricky to stay on track. So you have to know why you're doing what you're doing. And then lastly, communicate the vision to stakeholders. It's not enough if you're an executive director to have a deep conviction about racial justice if your board chair and your directors don't understand what you're doing or why it matters. And so communicating that vision is essential. Number 3, people. Diversity impacts every group of people involved in your organization or community. So here are a few groups that might touch on a business or company or organization. The board chair, board of directors, investors. If people are investing financially in what you're creating, they have a huge stake in what happens and how it happens and why. Your team, so the people who are serving under you or who are coming alongside you to execute a vision. Contractors, so the random person that you hire to build your website or to design your logo or to build out some part of your co-working space, which is a real tension that Plywood's navigating right now. Contractors. Your clients or partners, the people that you're serving. Your social media community, this is huge. Who are you following? Who's following you? How are their stories and your stories interacting? And then partnerships and sponsorships. Who are you collaborating with as you are going about whatever your vision and mission is in the world? Number 4, places. Proximity matters so much because where you spend your time determines who you know. This one's not rocket science, but if you're anything like me, you can be really picky about your spaces, like my coffee shop, my neighborhood, those sorts of things. So they matter. Neighborhood, your school or the place your kids go to school. Your faith community, if that's important to you. Coffee shops, restaurants, these are opportunities to diversify your life. Your office or your workplace. What changes can you make to build authentic connections with people who are not like you? It's a question to consider. This is really hard. Especially I talk to some people and they're thinking, well, I look at my neighborhood and my faith community and where my kids go to school and my office and everyone around me is literally the same. What do I do? And then when I say, oh, change one of those 4 or 5 areas, it feels really hard. I would imagine it's hard. I don't have children yet, so I don't know that whole story. But it's a difficult thing to do. And then lastly, stories. Stories are so important. There are the stories that we inherit. I love to ask people, what did your grandparents or parents teach you about race, about your race, about the races of other people? Our families transmit so many ideas to us. And if we don't ever find time or make time to interrogate those narratives, they're impacting how we live and lead. There are the stories we believe unconsciously. I'm sure you've heard or read or thought about unconscious and implicit bias. I'm not going to get into it here. But those biases start when we're like 2, 3 years old, and then they get reinforced our entire lives. So those are in the room with us, those stories. There are stories we pursue, whether it's from our news outlets or the books we read or the people, again, that we follow on social media. Those are opportunities to reshape your thinking. And then this is a little repetitive, but they're the news stories that we listen to and choose to believe. When we're confronted with the story of another person and it majorly disrupts our worldview, the temptation is to assume it's not real, doesn't exist, they're overdoing it. But it's really, really powerful, and it completely shifts the dynamic when we choose to believe the stories that are really hard for us to receive. It really changes the game. So 5 areas: you, vision, people, places, stories. I often tell people to pick one, and then we spend time diving into what that looks like for them in their lives. But yeah, 5 areas to consider as you close the diversity gap. A few closing thoughts. Change takes as much time as you want it to. I used to tell people, oh, this change is so hard and it's going to take forever. And in some ways that's true. But there are some changes you can literally make tomorrow. Like go buy a new book, go pursue a new team member, some of these changes aren't that complicated and they don't take 10 years. They can start whenever you want to. So change takes as much time as you want it to. Number 2, change will be met with resistance. Prepare for it. It always is. Whether you're trying to diversify your team or you're trying to save more money or like any goal that you have for progress, there's resistance. And so you have to prepare for it and find ways to push through when it gets really hard. Number 3, you cannot have diversity without disruption and discomfort. If it was easy, everybody would do it, but it's incredibly uncomfortable. Even on my team at work, there are only 3 of us right now. My boss is a white man, my peer is a white woman, and then there's me, black woman. And even just in us trying to talk through creating a lineup for an event or a piece of content that we're about to post somewhere, I mean, it's really disruptive to pause and consider, hey, is this the best we can do? Are we adequately representing these stories? How is this affecting us? Like it's really uncomfortable, but you can get used to it and you can build resilience for it. So expect that discomfort. Number 4, clarity makes accountability possible. A lot of leaders will get into this work and they don't have clarity on their purpose or any part of it. And then when someone tries to hold them accountable, it's like, well, what did we even say we were going to do? And why did we say we were going to do that? And when things remain vague, you cannot measure it, and you don't know if you're making progress. And so as much clarity as you can generate, the better, because that's how you actually move the needle. You don't have to do this work alone. Invest in the support that you lead. There are coaches and authors and facilitators who they've devoted their lives to seeing racial equity be embedded into the foundation of our society. So I often love to tell people, you don't have to be an expert on this, just like you don't have to be an expert on how to buy a house or how to manage your money. Like you outsource some things. And so this is work that you can get support in. Consider what that might look like. And then lastly, diversity is a culture that you create. Be brave, be intentional, and cultivate it. Thank you. That's all I've got. Awesome. All right. Do I stand here?
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming, Bethany. So we're going to kick off the Q&A session. So me and Huda over there are going to be the moderators. So this session is being recorded. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. All right. Who wants to kick it off?
Hey, Henry, I'm a second-year MBA student. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
So in companies where they're highly STEM, and there's like systemic issues that have prevented diversity in those industries, what's like the chicken or the egg method to try and get that? So, obviously people like to see themselves in those roles, and we want to increase that, and then that hopefully, predicts more. But how do we speed that process? Because it's going very slow as of right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. What comes to mind, because I'm not an expert on STEM fields at all by a long shot, but I have a good friend who is. He leads a small software engineering company here, actually. And he and I were talking about some of the challenges he's seeing in his industry, especially with recruiting people of color and women. And so he's in the process of changing his business model to create a school or some sort of training pipeline and pathway that he can specifically then have a pool of people that have been trained in the skill set that he needs, but they also come from more diverse skill sets than he's had on his team in the past, and then trying to figure out how to hack some of the systemic barriers. So if people don't have access to certain kinds of computers, how can he build out a model to make that happen? And so I tell that story to say I don't fully know, but I do think it's important that people within those industries set aside time and resources to imagine what that industry needs to see change happen. I'm sure people are doing that. But I really admire how he approached me. He's a white guy who was like, hey, this is a problem. I don't see anything out here that's really solving it. I'm thinking of creating this, and I have a board of advisors of people from these backgrounds to make sure that I'm not creating something problematic. And then he's executing on it early next year. And so I love seeing those kinds of innovations that are rooted in a very deep awareness of the problem for that industry. Great question.
Thank you for coming. So empathy and emotional intelligence are two words that go very well together, and they seem like they would really fit the theme of your talk. A lot of people here know what empathy is, but emotional intelligence is sort of something that's a little bit less well known, but when it's practiced, it does wonders. Can you talk a little bit about how you were sort of exposed to the fact that it is a thing, and like when you became enlightened, like what that aha moment was like, and when the switch flipped, how you started practicing that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think, and I hope this response is adequate, I think I've been on the negative end of people having poor emotional intelligence and a lack of empathy enough to know it when I see it. And so I think that's I'm like, oh, I've experienced it when it's gone badly. And so I know some of the things that feel better. Like if I, as an underrepresented minority in my context, sit down with my white supervisor and I try to tell him about an experience that I'm having, and his response is, oh, that's not important, you're overthinking it, then that just like pulls me way back in. I'm like, I probably need to quit. I can't work here. But if he responds and says, oh, that sounds really difficult, tell me more about that, even if he can't solve the problem, but he acknowledges and affirms my experience, I think that's a degree of emotional intelligence to say, I don't understand this. I might not even be able to fix it, but I can listen well and not demean her and not distrust her. So that's kind of how I've seen it play out, because I've worked with people who've done both things, and I've experienced like, whoa, when someone leans in and listens, it opens up this entire new world of trust and culture making that I think is really powerful. So, yeah. Hi.
Hello. Oh, good. All right. Thanks for coming, by the way.
Oh, of course.
I was taken by your second story, the female architect that was working, I presume it must be a very small architectural firm. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a small one. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you're aware that, probably most of the people are aware that EOC laws don't apply to very small firms.
Okay.
Like that, there's like a 15-person cutoff. Some of them might even be as high as 20.
Okay.
But I guess my real question is basically this. What do you say to somebody like that when they're in a very small firm where they are likely to be isolated, either because of their race or their religion, and because of that, they feel that they cannot be themselves? I mean, is your advice that they should just leave the organization, or is your advice that they should develop some intentional leader, or what do you say to a person like that to provide some guidance to them, or to anyone in this class that might be in that situation themselves?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. In this particular instance, her plan was to leave the industry altogether, which was really hard for her, like completely. I was like, you're not going to be an architect anymore at all, and that was because she felt like she couldn't. Yeah, her plan, I haven't talked to her since January, but that was her plan at the time. I tend to, especially if I'm talking to other people who might be in that situation, I ask them, what's it worth to them? Because it might be worth it for a season to stay, whether it's a financial goal they want to meet or a professional goal they want to meet. I tend to try, and I stole this from someone who does this coaching with me, so it's not my idea, but trying to help underrepresented minorities step back and figure out what their options are. I know a lot of women in my situation, they tend to think either I have to double down and just accept that this is going to be miserable, or I got to quit in 2 weeks, which isn't really realistic. So it's like, how do you step out of it and consider, if I'm going to stay, what makes it worth it? And then what would make it not worth it? So maybe it's a compensation package, or maybe you want your job to begin paying for therapy, or maybe something really problematic has happened and you need to file a lawsuit and you need to explore that option. I really think it's important to figure out what your options are, and then what's it worth to you to stay if it is a toxic environment. Because there might be things that you can leverage in that context. So, but then sometimes I tell people, hey, your emotional health is not great and your mental health is not great, and that's worth protecting. And so if it gets to be that bad, I would advise that people leave.
You know, in that situation, that lady had actually tried to be herself, more aggressive, and was beating back somehow.
Yeah.
Or was it just
I think it was a little bit of both. I think when you're, and this, I don't know, I won't assume this is true for every person of color or from a minority experience. You have a lifetime of experiences that teach you when it is and is not okay to be yourself. And so it probably wasn't all culminating in that one moment, but you learn over the course of your lifetime how to survive, honestly. And so I don't know for her. I don't know. That's a good question, though.
What would your advice be to, if you try to be yourself, and if it doesn't work, that you might consider it?
I would maybe consider leaving. Yeah, it's always an option.
At least try to expand your...
Maybe. It would depend on the situation. I think it's easy to say, oh, just try to be yourself anyway. But I think if it was that easy, people would do that more. And so whether it's factors that I'm aware of or not, I think that's the rub. Easier said than done, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So as most of us in the room are college students, like ready to enter the workplace, as far as the like 5 different spheres go, don't really have a lot in like the family like neighborhood yet. So
Same,
what
yeah.
would you say to someone who's like looking to kind of enter that space and what to look out for?
Yeah, well, what spaces do you spend your time in currently?
I guess more just like clubs, maybe like fraternities, sororities,
Yeah.
Greek life, that area. So.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, you have to look at your life as it actually is and then pick. and so I don't fully know, but I mean, if I were to look at my life, for instance, I also don't have children yet, and so I'm not worried about school so much, but I eat out a lot, and so it's like, what can I do to change up where I go out to eat and to connect with new kinds of people, or how can I be intentional about who I'm inviting to come with me to get to know them? I think that's a big thing. I would imagine maybe if you're a student, I mean, a lot of you are students, you could pursue clubs that would have different experiences or opportunities for you. I think you just look at your life and map it out and say, okay, I want to start changing things up over here, and just pick and go in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. So my question is about the plywood people and the kind of work that you do. So it sounds like a really cool description, leading a community of startups that are doing good, but I'm not exactly sure, what you guys are doing with these startups, the kind of events that you organize. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what plywood people is doing to kind of make that happen?
Yes, wonderful question. So Plywood, we do quite a few things. We do a lot of events, some that are smaller creative gatherings where we pick a topic and invite 3 to 4 speakers on that topic. So we've done ones on dignity, on marketing, on storytelling. And so those tend to be smaller, 100 people. We set up a stage, have beer, and we just listen to them share their ideas, and we ask them questions. And then we blow that up, and we have a large event every year called Plywood Presents, and that is where we bring in national thought leaders or speakers on whatever the theme is for the year. And we just had our 10th event, our 10th anniversary, I guess 10 years, this past August. And so we think about events, if you think about sales funnels, events are at the top of our sales funnel, and so, well, maybe above events would be like social media streams, so we create a lot of content and write books and those sorts of things. Then we have our events. After our events, for people who are in the audience and they're thinking, hey, I have a company that I want to start, or I have a project I want to do for the next 3 years, we walk them through what we call the Plywood Process, and there are 3 stages to that. There's Path by Plywood, which is a 6-week digital curriculum. A lot of people think they want to start a project, but then they can't get through 6 weeks of content, and not even just content, but 6 weeks of thinking about the problem they're trying to solve. And we're like, well, maybe you shouldn't, devote lots of money and time to this if you don't want to think about it for this long. So we have Path by Plywood. Then we have Foundations, which is kind of like an incubator. It's a 4-month process with a retreat where we help you build your business model and think through the story you're telling. And we connect you to a lot of mentors and advisors who can help you troubleshoot in the areas that you need support. And then after Foundations, we have Layers. And Layers is monthly coaching and mentorship for founders. They come to our co-working space once a month, and we bring in advisors to coach them on everything from cash and operations to refining their business models, again, that sort of thing. And then we have a co-working space. So we were in Cabbagetown. We've been there for 4 to 5 years, but we're moving to the West End. Our co-working space is being built out as we speak. Should be done in December. You're all invited. Plywoodpeople.com. Thanks for asking. I could talk about plywood all day, so yeah. Hi.
My question is, I guess it's twofold, but kind of related to Saba's question about plywood and the great work that you all do, and if you all plan on incorporating some of this work that you're doing with the startup founders that are there. And my second question, which was my original question, was you mentioned that folks should work on developing racial and ethnic awareness.
Yes.
And I don't know if you had any like tips for how folks might begin going down that journey if they are so interested.
Yeah, that's a great.
Maybe like a book or two that might help them. Or how do
Awesome.
they find books?
Yeah, great question. So your first question, is there a plan for Plywood to integrate some of what I'm doing into our main programming? The answer is yes. Again, easier said than done, mostly because, well, it's easy for this to be a standalone body of research. It's hard to figure out how to fold it into everything else, but we are working on it. Everything from our visual content. We've been way more intentional about who we platform, like who's on our stages. I think we're getting better at that and who's sharing ideas. But I think especially around the power and equity piece, I didn't talk about equity explicitly, but that's what I was getting at. I think that's the tricky thing, helping people think through business models that are really dignifying and not patronizing. And so that's harder work to do, but it's something I hope to continue building towards. And then in terms of if you're thinking, how do I grow my racial and ethnic self-awareness? There are a few things. A book I highly recommend is I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Brown. It's a memoir and of a black woman. And so I love her story because it resonates with me so much. But I think it's accessible if you're trying to understand some more of the stories that get inside the experience. A trick that my good friend Kayla does is when she wants to figure out who she should talk to. Okay, let me back up a little bit. I think it's important to consider how you normally grow in self-awareness as a person. So for me, I'm really big on journaling, writing, self-reflection. And so I spend a lot of time doing that. If for you, you get insight by talking to a friend or by reading more, like find the thing that works for you. Don't try to do everything. So my friend Kayla, she loves to read, and so she will find an article or a book or a quote, and she'll post it on Facebook and see how people respond. So if people like start to troll her, she's like, I'm not talking to them to process this. But if people have sincere questions, she'll get coffee with them to unpack what they're learning from it. And so I think that's a really interesting and stealth way to find other people who can learn with you. And then I also, another resource, which is also by Austin Channing Brown, is The Next Question. It's a video series that she's doing, so I really love that and would check it out. T&Q show. The Diversity Gap has a podcast, so you can check that out. Season 1 is almost done. Yeah, that's a few options. I feel like I need to come up with better a resource list. I don't have one, but I can create one at some point. Yeah.
What are some of the projects that Plywood is working with?
Oh, great question. Let's see. So many different things. There's one woman named Laurel who's the founder of a company called Bea Made, and she is trying to disrupt the fast fashion industry, especially for children's clothes. And so Bea, B-E-Y-A, she has like a whole body of content around not only what clothes are actually made of, but how people can opt into slow fashion trends for little kids. So I think that's fascinating. There's a guy named Scotty Rowell. I forget the name of his business, but he does a lot around visibility for LGBTQ not for kids. His programming's for kids, but he's trying to increase and elevate the conversation around gender identity and LGBT inclusion for kids through puppet shows. And so he like hand stitches all these costumes, and his work is really wonderful. There's a guy named Terrence Lester who's the founder of a nonprofit called Love Beyond Walls, and he is doing a lot to elevate the stories of people who do not have homes or who live on the streets. We have lots of graphic designers and creatives in our community who are trying to figure out like give back models for the work that they do. So that's a few. It's funny how in the moment I'm like, who do we work with? But that's a few of the people that come to mind. Oh, there's another person right here.
Hi again.
Hi.
So throughout your tenure, you've had a lot of experience being not only a social entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur for social good as well. The advice that you'd give to someone who wishes to do what you did, I would imagine would look quite different than someone who says, I want to be the next, maybe not Mark Zuckerberg, but like Elon Musk or someone like that. So what advice would you give to everyone in this room if they're looking to be an entrepreneur, I would say like traditionally versus or entrepreneur for social good?
So can you clarify, so what kind of advice would I give to someone who wants to be a social entrepreneur as opposed to a more traditional entrepreneur?
Correct. If you could compare and contrast, that'd be helpful as well.
Yeah. I don't know that I can compare and contrast very well because I've never done the traditional route. I would say it's really important, if you have a social impact venture in mind, it's important to align your venture with your purpose and with your own story. Because if it's not aligned with who you actually are, you're not going to have what it takes to get through it. Because I think it's just really hard. Or you'll start to cut corners when it gets uncomfortable. So I think in as much as you can align what you're doing with who you actually are, that's the best thing, number one. Number two, I would suggest that you get around good people who understand what you're doing or who can try and can support you and encourage you in it. If you're trying to do something that's never been done before, truly, then it's really hard and confusing, and you lose a lot of sleep, and you waste a lot of money, and the only things that get you through that is knowing why you're doing it, why you're the right person to do that, and then having people in your corner who can stand with you when things get tough. That's what I would highly recommend.